Live in a manner worthy of your call. Live in a manner worthy of your call. This is the exhortation that the church at Ephesus received from St. Paul in our second reading today. Live in a manner worthy of the call that you have received from God, your vocation. What happens? What happens when we don't live in a manner worthy of the call that we have received? Be we parents, spouses, priests, bishops, or cardinals. When we don't live in the manner worthy of our call, lives are destroyed. Real lives can experience real destruction when we don't live in a manner worthy of our call. Some of you may know a very popular cardinal, maybe the most prominent churchman, one of the most prominent churchmen in the Catholic Church in the United States over the last 50 years, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. He was Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., prior to that, Archbishop in New Jersey, and then a bishop of a smaller diocese in New Jersey, and he was very, very influential. Carried a lot of weight. His words had a lot of weight. His actions had a lot of power in the American Catholic Church, and certainly in the church worldwide, on the world stage, and especially in Rome. And he retired in the mid-2000s and has still been active, but one of the most prominent churchmen, probably in the last 50 years. Yesterday, Cardinal McCarrick resigned from the College of Cardinals, and Pope Francis accepted his resignation and has made him go into a life of penance and prayer pending a church trial. A few weeks prior to yesterday, on the front page of the New York Times, one of the most read newspapers in the entire world, it was discovered that Cardinal McCarrick had been abusing a child a long time ago, a teenage boy, about 30 years ago. And after this report, more reports kept coming. Reports that Cardinal McCarrick had been using his position as a bishop and an archbishop to abuse seminarians, those studying for priesthood, and even younger priests, using his position to make sure that they didn't say anything. Equally tragic to this is the fact that a lot of people knew about it. From 1998 to 2004, numerous allegations against then Bishop McCarrick and Archbishop McCarrick. Between those years, reports and allegations were received by other bishops who did nothing, who did absolutely nothing. In fact, one priest who worked at one of the seminaries where Cardinal McCarrick had been abusing seminarians went all the way to Rome to beg the Holy Father not to allow this man and not to name this man a cardinal because of his abuse of seminarians. And of course, he was named Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C. There were 2 lawsuits settled in secret in 2004 and 2007 of a small diocese in New Jersey. These lawsuits were taken out by 2 of his priests, then former priests. No one knew anything about it. No one said anything about it. One of these priests actually brought this allegation to the diocese years earlier, after Bishop McCarrick had been moved to a different diocese. He brought it to his new bishop. The bishop put him in therapy, and when he got back, was welcomed home with the gift of being made to switch to another diocese. Being thrown out of his own. What happens when we don't live in a manner worthy of our call? Destruction of lives. And it is always a very particular, scandalous, and evil destruction that ensues when it is that of a priest, bishop, or cardinal. Because it is not supposed to be that way for anyone. But for us who stand in these God-given positions, it is especially horrific, and it is a particular kind of destruction. But that's not the only thing that happens. What else happens? What other evil ensues when we live in a manner not worthy of the call of our vocation that we have received from God? And this evil, this consequence, while not as immediately as tragic and disgusting, this consequence, this evil, is much more insidious, much more subtle, and much more widespread. What happens is people stop listening. People stop paying attention. Because why should they? Why should they pay attention? When evil like this is allowed to happen, period. Why should they pay attention? And to prove that point, I want to take us all back, for those who can remember, back to 2002. Almost everyone here will probably recall in 2002 was a watershed moment in the life of the American Catholic Church. It was the time that the news media began to, rightfully and justifiably so, bring to the attention of us, the church, that for decades there were priests abusing young people and bishops were covering it up. You'll probably all remember that very, very long moment that apparently hasn't stopped. And in that time, almost every Catholic knew about this based on these reports that the news were giving us. We were all talking about it. We couldn't believe it. Almost every Catholic knew about it. Almost every Catholic was talking about it. Almost every Catholic was listening. Almost every Catholic was listening. And as one priest that I was reading this past week pointed out, at about that time, and because of the priest scandals that emerged in 2002, bishops began to abdicate, dioceses began to abdicate, priests began to abdicate their positions of shepherding. Messages and statements began to be put out that were precisely crafted, heavy in legal language, overly concerned with PR and public relations, and clearly put together by directors of communications. Messages that more or less said, we just want to make sure we get out on the right side of this issue. We're going to very stoically condemn what happened, and we're going to propose some procedures. And we're sorry. That's the message people were listening to. And for years, that's a message we've been receiving. Not messages of shepherds, messages of lawyers, messages of directors of communication, messages of PR firms. Not shepherding. Nothing about sin. Nothing about repentance. Nothing about the fact that if you make hell for people on earth, you are destined for hell beyond earth. Nothing about leading us, being the first on the front lines to do acts of penance and reparation for the sins that you and I didn't commit, but for the damage and the destruction done by it. People were listening for that. We were listening for that. That's not what we heard. Fast forward to today, 2018. How many people, and raise your hand, how many people knew about what is going on with Cardinal McCarrick? There's one. A couple here. Nobody's listening. And that's the point. What happens when we live in a manner unworthy of the call that we have received? People stop listening. People stop paying attention. Because why should they? Why should you be paying attention? When the messages you hear with the most basic and fundamental and most egregious sins that the church has ever endured, these are the messages you hear. Lawyers, directors of communications, and just simple messages. We just want to make sure we're getting out on the right side of this thing and not shepherding. And we, the clergy, we bear a huge amount of that fault. We are guilty. And more guilty than anyone else as to why people are no longer listening and why people are no longer paying attention. Because we've abdicated our responsibility and the grace of shepherding. But it's not all on us. We're not the only reason why people are no longer listening and paying attention. One of the more common interactions that I have with parishioners around here is when parents or grandparents approach me and they say something to the effect of, Father, my kids are no longer practicing the Catholic faith. My son, my daughter, my children have stopped going to Mass. And so I ask them, have you talked to him? What have you said to him? And they say, I've said a lot. But they are not listening to me. But they are not listening to me. What happens when we don't live in a manner worthy of the call that we have received from God? Be we priests, bishops, cardinals, spouses, parents, and grandparents. What happens is people stop listening. People stop paying attention. And so how do we change a church? How do we change our church? Our parishes. Parishes that are still sick from the abuse that has continued to go on, not just in the United States, but in the world as well, in the world church. And let's be honest, no one's going to call us and ask us our opinion. What should we be doing, Father Dustin? What should we be doing, parishioners of St. Gabriel and St. Bridget? No one's going to call and ask our opinion. But we know the answer. How we change our parishes, how we change our church, how we restore a credible voice, the voice of salvation, the voice of Jesus Christ, how we restore that so that people listen is by giving a witness, living our lives in a manner worthy of the call that we have received. Our lives should be marked, clearly marked by a hunger for the sacraments of confession and God's mercy, for the sacrament of the Eucharist and Mass. Do we display that hunger to each other and to our own children within our own families, that we cannot live without these things? Or do we show up half-heartedly at best? Because that's not worth listening to. Our lives should be marked by prayer, deep prayer. Do we set aside time intentionally every day? Not just if we make or if we find time, do we set aside time, put it in our calendars for prayer time each day as families and as individuals? Or do we simply say our prayers before meal and call that a prayer life? Because that is not worth listening to. Our lives should be marked by sacrifice, difficult sacrifice. Do we tithe sacrificially? Do we give to God what already belongs to God? To the point where we feel pain, where we feel the sacrifice? Or do we hold back? Do we steal from Him? Do we make time for the poor and the marginalized? And I know our lives are busy. Your life is busy. But do we make time for the poor and the marginalized, those who are going through trials right now in our parish and outside of our parish? Or do we ignore them? Do we offer our pains and our frustrations? Do we offer that up to our Lord on His cross and uniting that to the sacrifice of Christ in prayer? For the salvation of all, for the healing of all? Or do we rather just take our frustrations and our pains and complain about it? Do we work hard every day, or do we hardly work? Are you and I worth listening to? Is our life worth paying attention to? Do we accept the responsibility of understanding our amazing faith, a very reasonable faith? Or do we largely respond to questions about our faith, be they from our children, grandchildren, or fellow Catholics? Do we respond with, I don't know, and leave it at that? Because that's not worth listening to. What happens when one fails to live in a manner worthy of the call that they've received from God? We know that answer. We know it all too well, and it's a disgusting answer. People don't listen, and lives are destroyed, and we're tired of it. We've got to be tired of it. The real question, the more interesting question, the more exciting question is what happens? What happens when we do live in a manner worthy of the call that we have received? The call to be married and to be a spouse and to give your life away to another and to receive that gift equally from that other. The call to be parents and to raise new life and raise up saints. The call to be priests. What happens when we do actually live in a manner worthy of the call that we have received? That's worth finding out. That's worth doing and changing our church. And maybe that's something worth listening to.